approximately 20 minutes for our Q&A before we have a break, and we'll resume at 4:30. So I wanted to open up the floor to questions for our three speakers. And if you could please state your name before you ask the questions. All of you.
Graham. So thank all the speakers, really interesting papers. The question, I guess it's directed to you, Sarah, just in relation to what's sacred about Black Rock City, Burning Man, and you talk about impermanence and ephemerality, and I think that I'm not really sure this is a question, but more of a comment that maybe you could relate to, that the ephemerality of the city is an allegory for the ephemerality of life. And I think that permeates the culture and is one of the reasons why it has such a significant sort of magnetic pull. And I think that your talk evokes that, and your discourse around the temple and the significance of the temples evokes that or magnifies that in some way.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think yes, but I mean, I guess for me, it's both the ephemerality and there's a permanence and a substance there too. I mean, that's partly what I think is so powerful. It's that it's both of those. It is ephemeral. It does appear and disappear, and yet there are these traces, and there are our bodies that are changed, and there are our spirits that are changed. And so yes, it's a sense that life is short, and we're only on this. I mean, depending on your religious views, but for many of us, life is short. This is it, and we don't really know what happens in the afterlife, or we maybe have some ideas, but that's not the important thing. And so then we see how all of these people who have died live on in the temple. So I mean, again, I think it's both of those things, our sense of our own impermanence, but also that there is this sort of ongoing presence of the dead and of our own experiences in the temple. And so I think that's, to me, what's partly powerful is the blend of those two things.
Of course, James, cultural appropriation. It's such a big issue, but then the movie about the in the comic movie
Black
Panther came out, and that was actually conceived by white people, but then mostly black people, and it made such a big difference to the black community all over the world. Just with the comic movie, it's like the positive can change so much, because the negative, I think, is mostly white people that discuss appropriation. It's not necessarily the people who have the culture, they're not against it, other people using it, it's more people, intellectuals, they want to discuss that.
I'll just speak to the US case, and that what's interesting is that I think that there's a ratio between current disenfranchisement and the amount that people are speaking about cultural appropriation. So for example, we see a lot of talk out of Native communities. I don't think it's fair to say that Native peoples are not speaking about cultural appropriation. They're speaking volumes about it, so maybe people aren't listening. Same with African American culture. There's a lot being written about it within cultural studies, etc. But there were a couple interesting cases where African American, Latinx students on campuses and Native students protested against a white kirtan singer, and then Hindus came out, Indian American Hindus came out and said, we love it when white people perform our culture. So there is certainly debate there. I don't think it's fair to say it's mostly whites talking about it, but for example, the project to decolonize the canon at Oxford was sponsored by white students attempting to kind of perform a leftist politics, which can become policing and absolutist.
So I think there was a hand in the back.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Dr. Petra. We talked earlier about the difficulty of funding. Some of you, if not all, do you have experience on what are the arguments that you get funding for Burning Man theme research, and what do you think? What are your opinions? Why is it so difficult for the funding bodies to grant this?
Well,
For the,
I can
for the US,
start.
or- yeah.
I mean, certainly in the U.S. case, I mean, I've been researching what would be considered sort of fringe movements for my whole career, and I think that they're treated as suspicion and not taken seriously, that these are frivolous, that these are, on the boundaries. I mean, from my perspective, it's the stuff on the boundaries where the important cultural work is getting done, and the important cultural issues, like some of the ones you raised and some of the ones you raised, are coming up. But I think funding agencies often don't see that. It looks risky to them, and they're not sure what the payoff is going to be. And so that's part of it in the American setting. I mean, I don't know about...
I would also say I think it's the prejudice in the study of religion toward Abrahamic traditions. Toward specific traditions.
Yeah.
So you get more funding to study Christianity than you would get to study Hinduism, and even less funding to study Burning Man than you would get to study Hinduism.
Right.
I have just a quick anecdote that when I got 30 grand to start off this project, and when I gave my report to the funders, they said, well, I didn't know we were paying people to go camping.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, my experience is from Canada and France and here, and it's basically the same thing. It's not useful. From the funding agents and the politics, it's not useful. They don't see the use of this, right? But there's also big resistance from the scientific community. I mean, sociologists, they want quantitative stuff and research on, they want you to work on real issues, real social issues, and institutional stuff. On the religious studies, when you get religion in there, there's also these questions. Here, you'll get a lot of money if you study migrants and their religious trajectory or whatever. I mean, it's almost a sure shot. What I had to argue for this is basically how relevant Burning Man was. That was my strategy, and it worked, but I don't know if that was the criteria. But basically my argument was that by looking at supposedly marginal movements, you are in fact looking through a lens at the mainstream. And it's basically seeing how social dynamics that shape tomorrow, but also shape today, appear in a purer form. So it's kind of, but also arguing, in the case of Burning Man, in the case of rainbow gatherings, we had to go at it by another slant, but with Katherine. But basically, it was saying that the socio-demographics of Burning Man were very integrated. So it was worth looking into this, and that the politics and religion at Burning Man were also exactly the trends that we see in wider society.
Yeah.
So by using that kind of argument, you got the money. So, which one worked? I don't know. Is it the mass effect? I don't know.
I would just say one thing on it. If you have to have a bigger umbrella, so like if you want to look at the gift, then talk about the gift. But you talk about a wider politics of representation. It can't just be Burning Man.
Or youth spirituality
Yeah.
or something else that's a much broader issue.
We'll start with Marion.
Dr. Lucia, Lucia or Lucia?
Lucia, you're.
Lucia. How many times did you look at Burning Man, and what other lens did you look at about this appropriation? Because I think this is really interesting. The Red Lightning incident definitely was pretty surprising, and when we examined it, we found that it was definitely being agitated by some radicals who hadn't been to Burning Man. So I'm super curious about like what else did you compare it to? Either multiple years of Burning Man or anything other festivals? Not just regular society, but these mass gatherings. What did you look at?
So this project, as I mentioned, I started in 2011, and I looked at 4 different types of festivals. So like a corporate yoga festival, like Wanderlust, Bhakti and Shakti Fests, which are really white folks performing Bhakti Hinduism in Joshua Tree. And then what we might call a smaller transformational festivals, like somebody had Symbiosis up, or Lightning in a Bottle, these kind of Burning Man littler versions of the same, maybe some parts of the same idea, and then Burning Man. And I mostly started looking at Asian religions, particularly Hinduism, and the ways in which it was performed and enacted and then taken over as a representational enterprise, and then the India's government's attempt to kind of patent yoga and patent some of the forms. So that's where it started. But then I couldn't ignore the way the indigenous religions were lumped in with Asian religions in this kind of old 19th century grouping of what the primitive was and is. And so that's what I see continuing today, which is unusual. We might expect this kind of racism from the right, but what we find is on the left, there's this very antiquated idea of who's modern and who's pre-modern.
Are you still studying and still involved in the study that you're doing?
Yeah, I'm trying to submit this book called White Utopias by January.
That's it.
So, gentleman in the back with the white.
Hello, my name is Lucia. I have a question for you, François. The slide where you had on one side trading, classic trading, and on the other slide was the gifting economy. Do you see these two economies as opposite, or is it
Super good
possible
question.
to combine?
Super good question. This is what you teach, this is what is thought worldwide in every faculty of Orthodox economics around the world. Cultural studies and anthropologists have shown that this does not exist. I've written extensively on how consumerism and through branding, consumerism today is selling experiences, authenticity, mythology, self-realization, except it's making a profit behind it. I wrote an article that apparently got Larry cranked up, showing how Burning Man was not against a consumerist mindset, but actually it was just doing the same thing. It was branding experiences, but without, putting money in the pocket, basically. That Burning Man was a logo. So it's not, the purity of Burning Man versus, the evil logo and Naomi Klein type of analysis. I think economic anthropology, which we don't read enough of, shows that in fact, it's the reality is always a mixture of gift economy within today's capitalist economy. This was perhaps not true in the 19th century, and even in Taylorist Fordist, but definitely in today's consumer society, consumerism functions on a sort of an ideal of the gift economy. This is why you don't buy cars anymore, you rent them. You buy this is in the management literature of car industry, you're basically buying a right to be identified with a brand. This is how they present it. This is why you can't buy a car anymore. And everything is made so that you rent it. So yeah, I don't know if I'm answering, I'm doing this, yeah?
Thanks.
Gentleman in the black.
Right, so curious about, so you talked about that you hadn't found as much transformational language with regard to the originals. And it got me thinking, because we see a lot of that actually, but people maybe not frame it in those terms and that. So it got me thinking about perhaps there's something, when we ask questions like that, we usually ask it as, do you see it as a prototype or practices you want to bring into the rest of your life? It's a little bit more restrained.
Mm-hmm.
Is there something with the evangelicalism and born-againness of American religion, as opposed to sort of the Calvinistic Protestant, where it's more subdued, not wanting to use something like a word of transformation, except if it's like you lying on the ground shaking, being born again. What do you think about that?
That's another. I want to hear about this. With the project, we don't really know all the time how to get at this, right? We just noticed that in some of the smaller events, for example, it seems, and what the surveys we have are hinting towards community as being the big thing. So we know that these quantitative surveys are bullshit, or at least they hide another side. So this is actually, you're answering the question more than I can answer the question. This is very interesting. That the exuberance of the American public, where you express this. In Europe, I'm learning that things are more subdued, the way that you said. So you're actually, I'm much more interested in hearing You talk to me about this.
Can I just briefly comment on
Yeah.
that? I mean, I think it's, so my training is in American religious history, and I think it is really interesting, the idea of being born again. You find in so many places in American spiritual movements and religious movements, however that's defined, but I mean, I've certainly heard Berners talk about being born again in some sense, and so that idea of a transformation, that you go from the way you were to something else, seems to me really quintessentially part of American religious history. And I think you're absolutely right that the strength of that evangelical model, which goes way back to the 1700s and earlier, is a really powerful part of that in the U.S. context.
But this is also globalized.
Yeah.
That's the thing. It's American,
Right.
perhaps, but not so. Because if you look
It's
at studies
traveled.
on Islam, I work on global religious change, so I read on everything. I try. And what you see is that in Pakistan, the language is born again Muslim. For anybody who's Salafi, or it's exactly the same thing. Pentecostals, it's the major religion in Latin America. It's the fastest growing religion in the world. And in Africa, they talk about being born again. So,
But
I think
started in
this-
the U.S.
Yeah,
I don't know
it
about the
started in the
Islam
US.
case, but certainly Pentecostalism.
No,
But it
it's,
is
uh,
interesting, that sort of transnational movement.
ISIS, Daesh, the initiation rituals into
That's
Daesh.
true.
You're born again, and it's
Yeah.
it's the
And you leave the old life
Pentecostal-
behind.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
So Kathy, and then
Interesting.
Mike.
Question for Amanda. Two, which I hope are quick. One of which is there a right move Burning Man can make on this? I don't actually see an actual way forward, as opposed to sort of just trying to be open and listen as much as possible. If you think there's another approach, I'd love to hear it. And then just a quick sort of personal thought that I would love to get your comment on. I'm increasingly convinced that this kind of issue cannot actually be resolved in the language of academic liberalese or liberal academia. That very approach through language makes it more difficult to resolve the issue. So just those two things. I'd love to get your thoughts.
I'm going to take the second one first, which is I always love this study that came out of the military, actually, that one of the fastest ways to break down racism is to get two different people of different backgrounds aligned toward a common goal. We actually found it in World War II and Vietnam and things like that, is that you have different people who have a common goal. So Burning Man has some of that. It's got a common goal. And I think that part of the reason for the really overt stereotyping, some of the worst images that I showed, comes from lack of contact. So, because you wouldn't do it if it was your friend, if you recognize their value system from their family, etc. So I think contact is part of it, and that is something that Burning Man has access to. Were it to be just already creating environments where very different people come together. So the diversity question, I mean, yes, we should go into this. Who was saying that suburbs with unicorns hats on, and he was saying that at lunchtime. That's not the way to build diversity at Burning Man, but to bridge those gaps in some sense. And then practically, I've seen a lot of other festivals issue kind of like a press release or a statement, particularly about the warrior bonnet in the United States context. That's about as limited as I've seen it. But as I mentioned in the talk, that may be against Burning Man principles. I'm sure there's a lot of burners who say, I want to do whatever the fuck I want out here, and no one should be able to tell me otherwise. So I think there's a bit of tactile compromise that the organization might just have to come down on one side or another, say what is radical freedom no matter what. Would we allow KKK marchers to go through Playa? Or is there some confine on that, like we might have in Tel Aviv or in India or in the Middle East if we were to do a regional burn there, where within certain parameters we would have to have radical inclusion?
Yeah, I can pass. I see Steven's hand up. I'll give it to him. No? Okay, this question is for Sarah. I was wondering about the role of anonymity in people's expression of grief at the temples. For example, if you have a funeral in the States, like you'll see the widow or the widower grieving and the family like soaking in tears, and it's all about their suffering, and it's contrived sometimes, and also it like makes the grief harder. And there's something about the temple where even though a lot of people at Burning Man know one another, I mean, it's still, over 70,000 people. So you can put your story, you can even put your name, but it's not necessarily going to be attached to you.
Mm-hmm.
So it gives you this space within which to
Mm-hmm.
grieve personally, but then also to like release it a bit more into the collective, because after those moments, it's kind of anonymous. And that was just a thought that had occurred to me as you were sharing your stories, and I just wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I love that aspect, the anonymity of it. And I think, because again, it's both. I mean, there is often, if someone beloved to you has died, you do share it with your close circle of friends, so you have that sort of personal connection. But then I think what you're saying about something about the anonymous others who are there with you, that sense of being part of collective grief, of not being, even with your small group, of not being isolated in some sense, that it's such a universal experience. That, I mean, I think that strengthens it, so you can have both. You can have what someone might have in a funeral, where you have your close friends around you and you're mourning somebody specific, or you can go there and have a very anonymous experience that's also really powerful. That I think the only thing that seems similar to me are some of the spontaneous memorials that spring up after tragedies. I'm actually in the process now of trying to help design something on campus for the fires, and really trying to think about what is that, because I think the temple really works, and trying to draw my experience of working at the temple and working on other memorials in the US, and think about what does work, so there's the personal quality. Lots of people in Chico and Paradise know each other, but it's a large enough community that there's going to be a lot of anonymity, and I think that works really well to have both of those present. And the other aspect to it is that my first experience at the temple was in 2001, where it was a dust storm, and I think in the dust storms there's a kind of anonymity in general that is typical of Burning Man for many of us, although not people that have maybe, I don't know, it differs depending on who you are. But there's that general sense of the intimacy and common experience with strangers, right? That is really unique in a city that size. So it doesn't completely answer you, but that's just some thoughts that I had, yeah. Yeah.
Well, we're a little bit past 4. Do you still want to take a few more questions, or do you want to?
Okay, the thing is, the coffee upstairs we have reserved for breaks from 4 to 4:30. By the way, apparently we can't go to just fetch a cup of coffee just as we want. We are restricted within, and we have paid for with coffee breaks between this time and that time. So the thing is, we could extend this maybe 5 minutes, but then we have 20 minutes of break instead of half an hour. So I don't know. Those who really need Java, go. We can maybe stay for another.
So people who would like to ask some questions, maybe 5 more minutes, and those who really need the desperate coffee, especially if you travel.
Yeah, exactly.
I know I saw a hand way in the back, but if not.
I just want to chime in on the previous conversation about cultural appropriation, which I'm grateful we're having, and something I think a lot about overseeing communication for working on projects. And we did actually publish a piece called Radical Inclusion, Listen Up Before Dressing Up, August of 2016. And
Thank you.
In our class of Burning Man Style, we invited members of the community who represented Indian communities and African American communities to talk about cultural appropriation, what is and is not appropriate at Burning Man. And so we share this piece like 3 or 4 times a year, and the struggle is, in a lot of things Burning Man related, is the signal to noise ratio and the amount of stuff that we're putting out all the time. So just put that in.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that. I was looking for
Didn't I
it.
write a piece arguing with that piece?
I think you did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also in Burning Man.
You guys argue with yourself.
Gentlemen.
François, my name is Rich. I'm just curious, and I have not read your work, and so you perhaps address this, but it strikes me that if you want to look at Burning Man from almost a religious perspective, it has some it's very reminiscent of some early events in, for example, American history. So the first Great Awakening in the 1730s, where these Protestant Reformations kind of swept through the colonies, bringing people together and often involving some kind of aspect of gifting and kind of communal gathering. Also around the same time, we saw the emergence of our sort of weird American secret societies. The Freemasons, which actually did start in America. this is a nation Irish thing, the Elks Club and so forth, which brought people together for mutual assistance. Again, this kind of notion of gifting and community creation. And then, of course, we also had our utopian stuff, everything from the creation of entirely new religions, the Mormon religion, to the folks at Oneida and so forth. So is this, it seems like this might just be a replication of a pattern that's happened again and again for some reason in the American context around community, mutual aid, and also some aspect of religion or spirituality that tends to go outside the model.
I sort of rephrased the question in a way, saying that our view of religion is very transcendental. It's basically vertical, right? That's inherited, of course, from Christianity. If we take a wider perspective on what religion has been since humanoids emerged from animalness, you realize that, in fact, this verticality is quite recent, and that tribal religions were much more about horizontality, or as an African ancestor religion, on the time axes. A definition of religion I work with is a system of gift on these three axes, and each religion is a variation on the assemblage, to use a term, of these three axes. So if you look at Confucianism or ancestor worship in China or African religion, then you're on the temple axis as being the major one. So this vertical thing has hidden us, even within sociology of religion and religious studies and whatever, that we've overlooked the community aspect. An American sociologist who's a friend of mine, and I love him as a scholar, James Pickard, has taken a Hopi perspective on American religion and shown that a Hopi person would see the women in the kitchen preparing the lunch after congregation as being the high point of religiosity. So I think this speaks to what you're, obliquely it speaks to what you're saying, is that in fact these are aspects that we've overlooked because we're Christianized in our relationship to religion. And if we go back to the Durkheimian, Mosian impetus to think religion from the savages to us and not the reverse, then I think we are much more well equipped to understand what's going on today, because today we're getting out of that verticality. And so the stuff that's popping up doesn't look like, smell like, taste like, the guys in robes that I had underneath the God religion pic. Yeah.
Can you speak to that real quick? Just to answer as well, I think that in the camp revivals in the Second Great Awakening, you had people rolling on the ground and barking like dogs, and radical inclusion, the mixing of races and sexes, and kind of free sex in some ways, some of the images. So yeah, it was definitely there. The one big difference that I would see is that First Great Awakening you have Jonathan Edwards, Second Great Awakening you have Lorenzo Dow, right? There's no big famous itinerant preacher at the center of Burning Man, and that's a huge difference.
Or is there? Maybe Larry Harvey was sort of the itinerant preacher from the Gospel of the Ten Principles. I don't want to overstate Larry's importance. I think he's incredibly important, but I think in the modern world of kind of social media and so forth, maybe we didn't need a single central figure. We just needed the memetics to get out of some charismatic education.
That's an interesting question.
Thank you so much for the questions. Oh, sorry, Stephen.
Last one.
We'll have you do the last question, Stephen, and then we'll break.
Well, first of all, I really appreciated all three of your presentations. I think that they're all extremely relevant and bring interesting aspects of the culture to light. I think that in terms of the balance between radical inclusion and radical expression, and I think a new awareness of even terms like microaggressions, and the added complication in our culture of, as you well said, embracing fuckery and destabilizing things and being an assault to the senses, are all things that make how to address that problem very complicated, but it is very timely, and I think your questions are all on point. François, there was one thing, I loved your focus on gifting. It is the thing that I personally contemplate the most, although I think you really pushed how they all relate to gifting to a little bit of an extreme. When you bring up the difference between spirit religion and God-type religion and base it upon liberty versus obligation, or play versus ritual, I look at that and I actually see elements of both in our culture. I see ritual without dogma, and ritual is extremely important to our culture. I definitely see a focus on both ends of that spectrum and a balancing act between it. I mean, obligation to me translates into civic responsibility and liberty to radical self-expression as well as radical self-reliance. So I'm not sure that a two-dimensional view captures as much the complication as I'd experience the culture. But I think that you're right to say that there is an effervescent quality. There's experiences of awe. And spirituality without dogma, I think, is a phrase that a lot of, quote, burners can relate to.
Yeah, totally. You're right. This is the spectrum thing. I mean, I didn't have enough time to there's, Hamayon writes, there's a ritual latency in play, and there's a play latency in ritual. If you go, I won't go long on this, but social theory, if you look at social action theory, and you always have either you're reproducing models, Goffman theater, the social theater, or basically it's the agency. So basically social sciences have always looked at one or the other, but the right way to look at it is that basically there is no liberty without obligation, there's no obligation without liberty. We are in a culture, individualistic culture, where the radical self-expression comes more obviously than for early 20th century socialists who have the community aspect more sensitive. So I think it's also a reason why the religiosity kind of sticks on this area. But you never have one without the other, and there are rules to play, obviously. And when you play, you are obscene. You're not in the rules. Then people will come and tell you.
I think you're absolutely right to focus on play as an important part of the equation. We internally joke sometimes that the 11th principle for us involved with Burning Man is radical self-enfundment. And we don't always speak about it, but play is fundamental, I think, to innovation and imagination.
So,
Yes.
we close?
Can I say one thing in response to that, just real quick? It's just, I think that you actually maybe answered Caveat's question right there with the last thing that you said about fuckery. It's like, we just talked about Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence this morning, right? That's a great example of prodding through play to address major social issues.
Well, actually, ironically enough, that's something that began to up as part of our panel tomorrow. It actually segues very nicely into how we might approach that. I just didn't want to get into it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We will.